Oh hi, it's the next day and yeah, I'm at the foundation now. I am at the site 31 in America. So yeah, in Miami, where I used to live. But now I'm at SCP. Great. But hey, I asked for SCP. I want to be at SCP. I can tell you what though, if they experiment me with the son of the Scarlet King, or if they experiment me with the son of darkness, I will kill the cunt. Even the Demon King's son, I will kill him. I will kill. What should I watch? What should I watch? Disgusting. I cannot wait until one day I will be able to destroy the world. Let's watch this.
Picture the shyest female friend, relative, or loved one you know, and now you keep seeing her with this one guy, again and again and again. It seems like these days, all she does explain it, nobody can explain it. All you know is that for months on end, she has involuntary screaming fits, like something out of a nightmare, but still she always smiles. She seems happy, as long as you don't look at her eyes. There's something oddly glassy about them. They seem plastic, dead. Your friend is experiencing a dangerous phenomenon known to the SCP Foundation as SCP-3512, an anomaly that only seems to affect women between the ages of 18 and 40. One woman is already dead as a result of this, and an additional 9 others affected by this strange anomaly have been cataloged and contained in standard humanoid containment chambers for study. At first, the Foundation couldn't draw any logical conclusions for why these women were spontaneously experiencing total personality changes and pronounced screaming fits. All the Foundation had to go on was that the first cluster of infected individuals originated in Barcelona, Spain. A Foundation facility in Boston dispatched one of their best field operatives, Agent Riley Cooper, on an investigative mission to Barcelona. They wanted her to get to the bottom of this phenomenon, put a stop to it before things went any further. While in Spain, Agent Cooper would be assisted by a local Foundation operative, Agent Tomas Rey, whose intimate knowledge of the locale would provide a key advantage in the investigation. Together, they'd crack this thing and make sure no other women were harmed. At least that's what the Foundation had hoped. Instead, both agents disappeared under horrific circumstances during the investigation. And today, we're going to tell you about the final days of Agent Cooper and Agent Ray, and why attempting to investigate SCP-3512 was the last thing they ever did. Agent Cooper arrived on the 15th of July, 2016, and stepped out into the scorching summer heat of Spain. Agent Cooper was everything you'd want in a field operative for the Foundation. Intelligent, dedicated, and professional. She rendezvoused with Agent Ray, who was a comparatively smooth and laid-back figure. The two of them began their investigation by speaking to the friends and families of some of the infected women, pretending to be doctors working for the World Health Organization. Agent Cooper, in her personal diaries, noted how creepy and unreal the affected women seemed. Most of the interviews were unnerving and sad, but not exactly enlightening. However, as things drew to a close, a younger sister of one of the victims mentioned a single word: blackout. Even the mention of the word caused the victim to descend into another screaming fit. Agent Ray's local knowledge came in handy once again. He recognized the name. It was a popular local nightclub. Agent Cooper and Agent Ray knew they had to investigate the club, and went undercover as regular patrons. For the first several hours they were there, nothing happened. Then, at 2 a.m., a man approached Agent Cooper at the bar. He was a tall, blond man with an unsettling intensity to him. He asked, without a hint of irony, what Agent Cooper's favorite star was. There was something off about this man. His word choice was too precise, almost rehearsed. He wasn't drunk in the slightest. Agent Cooper intuited that this was the kind of guy who liked to take advantage of women in bars. When she threw a glance at Agent Ray, signaling him that something was off, the stranger quickly left. For Agent Cooper, this only further confirmed her suspicions. The agents paid off the bouncer to find out if the tall stranger was a regular, and then what his name was. After being slipped some cash, the bouncer was all too eager to share. This strange man came here all the time, and he knew his name too. It was Josep Oriol. Agent Cooper and Agent Ray wasted no time in finding Josep Oriol's apartment and receiving authorization to perform a comprehensive search on the premises. And as soon as they did, they found cause to declare the man a person of interest in the SCP-3512 investigation. The apartment was a smorgasbord of suspicious activity. Oriol was a software developer. He had extensive record.
Give me a second. I'm going to show you around in my room in a minute. See what? As you can see, this is the courtyard inside 30 in Miami, where I live. Then, this is my room. Interview area or interrogation area, they said, and then my room is this room here. Bed, lounge room, kitchen, nothing special. So, yeah. Press play.
It's on the architecture of the local area, including buildings, utilities, and railway tunnels. Josep correctly figured the investigators were coming for him, and had fled his home before they could get there. And this was only the tip of the iceberg. Agent Cooper and Ray then found a book with a plain cover sitting on Oriol's kitchen table. Cooper thought it was a publisher's proof, a kind of pre-publication prototype copy of a book. They collected it but didn't read it straight away, worrying about its potentially cognito-hazardous nature. And besides, they were a little distracted by the homemade monstrosity sitting next to it. It looked to Agent Cooper like a sculpted blob of wax, with a series of 12 makeshift legs made from is a small, plain steel building with a large door on one side. The door has no handle or knob, and functions similarly to a garage door. The door cannot be pried open by any ordinary means, and the inside of SCP-291 can only be accessed if the structure is connected to a suitable power source. Once a power source has been connected, the door raises and exposes a room inside. It is small, about 4 by 2 meters. It contains a console board, a large screen, and a plexiglass container resembling a coffin. How very sinister. The coffin is large enough to contain a human under 7 feet tall. So sorry, Ferdinand the Cannibal. You're going to need to sit this one out. The coffin sits on a conveyor belt with several tubes connected to the wall above it. On the opposite side of the room, there are holes of varying sizes, each containing a small door that can be opened or closed. Because initial observation indicated that SCP-291 was intended for some kind of human testing, a D-class test subject was selected for experimentation.
There's enough to stick. Then one day my buddy Quincy threatened to barf a swarm of bees on my face if I didn't shut my modem out, and that's been my stage name ever since. Now that we're properly introduced, you're probably wondering what cool tricks I have up my sleeve to get me that nifty SCP designation. Well, it's not because of my heightened manual dexterity, my juggling skills, my accordion-playing prowess, or even my nearly perfect impression of Jane Fonda as Barbarella. So if you guess any of those, you're way off base. See, I'm the subject of a quote-unquote spatial anomaly, accessible through my mouth and my throat. In plain English, I got a second stomach. Anything I swallow disappears into a pocket dimension made of anomalously elastic intestinal tissue, where it's stored until I need it again. If there's a limit to how much I can store in there, I haven't found it yet. The amount of stuff in there has no effect on my overall weight or my ability to move. Once it's in there, it's just kind of gone until I want it back. On top of that, my lower jaw can be stretched up to 6 feet. That's 2 meters for those of you weirdos who use the metric system, in any direction. So, in addition to being a juggler and a clown, I also made a killing as a geek at Herman Fuller's Circus. I don't mean geek as in owned a signed James T. Kirk Funko Pop that's still in mint condition. I mean the sense of somebody who gets paid to eat weird junk as a form of performance, although I have been accused by some of being both. Now you're probably thinking, Motormouth, my pal, my good buddy, there's so many careers you could have got into with that very specific set of skills. Garbage disposal, one-man moving van service, left luggage attendant at Grand Central Station. Sky's the limit, man. Well, sure, but I love the circus. They're the only family I've ever got in this world that came to them when I was just a wide-eyed punk kid of 8 years old, and they took me in like I was their own flesh and blood. Yeah, believe it or not, I wasn't actually born into the circus life. A lot of circus and performing arts folks are born into the industry. Born in a costume trunk, as they say. But unfortunately, that's not me. I was born in New York City on April 10th, 1976. My dad had took off long before I showed up, leaving me in the care of my dear old mom. My special abilities manifested early, and my mom recognized them right away. You know how little kids are always putting things in their mouths, right? It's cute when it's a block or an action figure, but less so when it's the entire coffee table. Yeah, my mom was fully aware of what I could do, and she hated my guts for it. Not only had a baby daddy flown the coop, but the kid she was raising was a freak of nature who she could barely stand to look at. And trust me, the feelings of resentment were totally mutual. One of my favorite pastimes as a youngster was to go out and find as many small animals as I could, get my little hands on, then go back inside where Mom was laid out on the parlor chair sleeping off one of her special grown-up headaches she got from downing a bottle and a half of her special grown-up juice. I made like I was gonna innocently ask her a question, smiling one of those adorable little 8-year-old smiles, then instead of saying anything, I just barf up a couple dozen rats onto her lap. Despite how much I hated living at home, it never occurred to me that I could leave. I was a pretty wide-eyed kid. Mom kept me isolated from the wider world. I guess out of fear that I'd eat somebody. But one night, as I was going to bed, I met Manny. Who's Manny? Come on! If you know anything about the Circus of the Squire thing, then you know Manny. Don't you guys already have a video on that? Manny's short for the man with the upside-down face. He was Herman Fuller's right hand, in charge of a lot of the backstage stuff, including, shall we say, talent acquisition. Who knows how he figured out where I was, or that I could even do what I do. But just like magic, he showed up at my window. Should I have been worried that a man with an upside-down face was at my window? Probably. But I guess I was just happy to see someone who was more of a freak than me. Manny offered me a place in a real family, where I wouldn't be cooped up. He said that freaks belonged out in the world, sharing their talents, making people laugh and cry and puke all over the place. I didn't hesitate. I took him up on his offer. Mommy Dearest was so deep in the drink that she didn't even notice I left. And that was that. From that day forward, I was a member of Herman Fuller's family. I never looked back. Not even once. Now, it may also surprise you to know that I wasn't always the picture of confidence I am today. My first job with the circus was as the human clown car. As a kid, I didn't have a lot of stage presence, and I didn't talk much, so the natural thing to do was to send me out to the ring and let the clown troupe come marching out of my mouth. to the surprise and delight of the audience. I learned juggling from a guy named Scythe. He was a human pincushion, but like most of us at Herman Fuller, his abilities were way beyond what you'd see at any common or garden circus. Scythe was incredible at what he did. You could stick a shiv in every square inch of this guy, and he'd never bat an eye. Total jerk, though, and awful with kids, so how he got the job of training me in the ways of the juggler is totally beyond me. If I so much as talked out a turn, he'd beat me in the head with a juggling pin. Not hard, just enough to hurt. I know, that sounds bad, but at least it toughened me up. I think Scythe was jealous of me in hindsight. I was a natural, and I think he saw me as, some kind of threat. Scythe eventually died and the fire stunt gone wrong. I held a funeral for him, but I was busy that day. Clowning I learned from a guy called Scruffy McGrubbins. Good old Scruffy. He had all the grace and countenance of a chain-smoking grizzly bear. He never minced words, never messed around with small talk. He just jumped straight into a conversation and expected you to catch up. I never knew what happened to the guy. I heard he quit the clown biz and settled down in a nice apartment in Kent. I hope he's having a good day wherever he is. So I did the juggling thing for a while, tossing around balls and pins and other junk and catching it in my mouth. Sometimes I'd put a plant in the audience, call them up, and swallow them whole as a part of the act. Eventually, I started working on a double act with another freak by the name of Theo. See, Theo could flip himself inside out, but he was also a pretty skilled acrobat. So he'd do a high dive jump over the audience, pull his insides outside, then aim himself down my gullet. It was a pretty great act, if I do say so myself. Theo and I even dated for a while. What can I say? I find guys just as fun to swallow as gals. After he and I broke it off, I decided I needed to change up my act.
Let's pause it. Head to bed. Wake up in the morning. Tomorrow is going to be my second day here at the foundation. Great. Head to bed, I guess. Seven in the morning. Chill. What you chill and smoke some weed.
That's when it
for the
hit
day.
me. Motor mouth. Picture this. Here's me, an assistant on either side, ready to pull my mouth open. Then a Chrysler comes barreling into a big top, hits a ramp, drives right into my mouth, into my second stomach. It was a dangerous act, a magic show, but not immune to being run over. But it was the best act I ever came up with. I could tell you some stories about my time with the circus. There was this one time my tapeworm started talking to me. At the time I was involved in overthrowing Herman Fuller himself and installing Icky as a new ringmaster. At the time I hooked up with one of the non-human capital C clowns. So this is a family-friendly channel, so maybe not that one. That's not what you want to hear, though, is it? You'd rather hear about how I got myself captured and locked up by the Miss SCP Foundation. Alright, why not? I've already spilled the rest of my backstory. So Manny, you remember Manny from earlier, right? He saved a lot of kids like me, and when he did, he usually put me in charge of teaching them how to perform. But there was this one girl he brought in who broke down crying in the middle of one of our juggling lessons. She said she wanted to go home. And that's when I knew that Manny had graduated from saving runaways and abused kids like me to abducting kids with powers. Of course, I confronted him about it. I told him point blank that's not how we do things anymore. Herman hadn't been around for years at this point. We were better than that. Gave me some garbage about him doing what he had to do to keep the circus alive. Can you believe that? Even with everything we were doing, he still thought the circus was on the verge of collapse. So I took the girl home, stored her in my gut, and snuck her onto the kaleidoscope. That's the machine we used to move all the parts of the circus from place to place. The kid was back with her parents before dinner. But when I returned to the circus, Manny was furious. In hindsight, I think it nearly killed him to do it, but he said he had to make an example of me. So, he threw me in a box, locked it with chains, and painted the words 4SC on the top. I was left out in the field in Kamifarano, Japan, like a wrapped present for Miss SCP. And that's how I ended up in containment. Truth be told, I've slept in prisons more comfortable than this place. The beds are hard, the food is gross, and the little red light on the security camera keeps me up at night. Not ideal conditions for a circus superstar of my caliber. But as my old pal Gory Lantern Skull used to say,
You know, he might even be in danger. What if he walks into a road and gets hit by a car? Would you really want that on your conscience? Questions like these were flying through the head of the Good Samaritan when he decided to go and investigate, when it seemed like everyone else was just content to pretend they didn't hear it and carry on with their day as normal. The Good Samaritan was a person not unlike yourself, They were also the kind of person we all hoped and wished we would be in a situation such as this. Kindness and generosity is a virtue, after all. The problem is there are people out there who know this and are willing to take advantage of that kindness and generosity. But even worse is the fact that there are things that are definitely not people out there willing to take advantage of human compassion too. But back to the Good Samaritan. He approached the sound of the distressed man in the alley. He looked old and frail, hunched over with the weight of his years. He wore thick, dark glasses, and his white cane was laying on the road a few feet away from him. It was a tragic scene, but thankfully the Good Samaritan was here to help. He approached the old man calmly, telling him that it would be okay. The Good Samaritan picked up the walking cane and passed it over to the blind old man. His face spread into a warm smile, and he said,
Thank you, young man. It warms my heart to know there are still good people like you on this earth.
The old man told the Good Samaritan that he'd come into town to get some fresh air and a little exercise, at which point he'd gotten lost. When the Good Samaritan asked whether it was safe for him to come alone, the old man told him that he always used to go on walks with his wife, but ever since the accident, she didn't seem to want to be seen in public. The Good Samaritan naturally felt for the old man, who seemed as sweet as he was feeble. He offered to escort the old man back to his house personally, wanting to make sure that he returned home safely. The old man smiled and graciously accepted, saying that his wife would probably want to thank the kind young man for helping him in person. Of course, the Good Samaritan was so wrapped up in the warm glow of doing a good deed that he never once stopped to question the strangeness of this whole situation. He just walked along with the old man, listening to him tell his fanciful stories as they left the city center and crept further into the sleepy outskirts of their small Kentucky town. He was just rambling on as old men tend to do. He told the Good Samaritan a little more about his beloved wife. She was a kind woman, who he'd known for as long as he could remember. His elementary school sweetheart, then his high school girlfriend, and not long after they graduated, his beautiful blushing bride. Oh yes, she'd always been the prettiest lady, until the accident. Curiosity was getting the better of him. The Good Samaritan couldn't help but ask what exactly the accident he kept alluding to was, and the old man was all too happy to give him an answer. Not that this answer was in any way pleasant. His wife had been trapped in a terrible fire in town that gave her severe burns all over her body. She was lucky to be alive. The flames took her beauty and her confidence away from her. Since then, she'd become a real homebody, often refusing to leave the house, and rarely, as they were walking up the small set of stairs to the porch, the old man stumbled slightly, causing his thick, dark glasses to fall to the floor. The Good Samaritan reflexively leaned over to pick up the glasses for the old man. As he passed them back, he noticed something strange. The old man wasn't just blind. He literally didn't have any eyes. Just two black, empty sockets where his eyes should be. The Good Samaritan was just thankful that the old man wasn't able to see him staring as he put the glasses back on. The two of them entered the house. The Good Samaritan was too busy thinking about the old man's empty eye sockets to even notice him locking the door behind them, and by then, it was already too late for him. The old man called out into the dark expanse of the house.
Sweetheart, I've got you a live one!
Before the Good Samaritan could ask what he actually meant by that, the old man shuffled off, deftly navigating the halls through memory alone, and took one of the two seats at the dining table. He just sat there, smiling, waiting. That's when the Good Samaritan heard the creaking sound coming from above, something moving up in the darkness of the second floor, and then descending the stairs with heavy, clomping footsteps. When his eyes came into focus in the dark, he saw it there, the most terrifying thing he'd ever witnessed, coming down the stairs towards him. It was vaguely human in its shape alone, but in all other respects, it was a monster through and through. This gnarled, twisted creature with bulging eyes, dead flesh, and filthy, exposed fangs, like it stepped straight out of a nightmare and into the physical world where it did not belong. There looked to be a huge hole in its lower torso, too, with no blood or organs inside. Just an infinite blackness. The creature's lipless mouth twisted into a smile. The creature said something in a voice that the Good Samaritan couldn't understand. It was the Black Tongue, something ancient, terrifying, and and unknown. As the creature got closer and closer, the Good Samaritan turned and made a run for the door. He tried to figure out the lock, his hands fumbling and uncoordinated by fear. He could hear the footsteps and the heavy breathing of that. He was so close, almost there. That's when a strange black substance seemed to encase the world around with grinning, lipless mouths. When they closed in on him, the Good Samaritan had the one consolation that at least it was over. But it wasn't. Not yet. The blind old man waited in the kitchen for 5 hours as unmentionable horrors unfolded inside the black sphere. The Good Samaritan was actually lucky all in all, because for some sessions for victims inside the sphere had lasted as long as 27 hours. He screamed the entire time, with the sphere finally demanifesting just moments after the screaming stopped. Remaining was only one of the creatures, but no Good Samaritan. Just several neat piles of human organs, arranged by organ type.
Are you down in there, honey?
The blind old man asked.
I've been getting awfully hungry.
Smith's Poppables. One pop, and you're in love.
There's no travel ban on taste. Take the flavors of street food home.
Huh.
The creature replied in perfect English.
Yes, yeah. I think you want some supper before you go tonight.
The creature picked up some of the discarded organs and took them into the kitchen, where it began cooking them into a stew for the old man. He ate the stew not long after, blissfully ignorant to its contents, and went to sleep. Whatever organs from the Good Samaritan weren't used in the stew were simply thrown into the fireplace to burn away into ashes. Later that night, the old man would die peacefully of a heart attack in his sleep at age 81. He spent the latter 10 years of his life in service of SCP-957. He'd never even had a wife, and when the monster first invaded his home, he wasn't even blind. He'd simply come home one day to find SCP-957 lurking in his home, waiting for him. As far as the SCP Foundation is aware, it always targets people who live alone. The man had tried to resist, but the creature was freakishly strong in spite of its wiry frame. It grabbed him and forced his body into the dark gaping chasm of its chest. He was swallowed up into another world on the other side of the void, and returned 4 hours later, a changed man. His eyes were gone, and he now firmly believed that SCP-957 was his beloved, if burnt-scarred wife of many years. He'd do anything for her, even heading out into the world and feigning distress to lure people back into her terrible clutches. That's how the old man became SCP-957-1. He wasn't the first, and wouldn't be the last. With the old man now dead, SCP-957 would demanifest and head off in search of a new victim, invading their home and repeating the cycle once more somewhere else. The somewhat happy ending is that in one of these cases, the SCP Foundation somehow got wise to the baiting activities of SCP-957, and they were able to contain the creature, giving it the Keter object class for its frequent attempts to either get out or lure in new victims. It's never been actively hostile to Foundation researchers and guards, just a little obtuse. Despite the fact that it's perfectly capable of speaking fluent English, it prefers to speak in an unknown dead language for somewhat mysterious reasons. Very little is known about the origins or true nature of SCP-957, but our brief glimpse into its interior life does little to comfort us. In 2008, the Foundation reported 957 having a conversation with an unseen individual in its native tongue. Foundation linguistic experts have been able to partially crack the code on what was being said that day. 957 asked the unseen figure how much longer it would have to stay here. The figure told it that it would need to wait there for a while, and that its disguise was extremely convincing. 957 complained that being here was boring and tiresome, but the unseen figure urged 957 to remain patient. It said, "Now go check out SCP-1861, the crew of the HMS Wintersheimer, and SCP-5049, the skin salesman Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot, for more of the most terrifying
Turn your designs into profit with Printful. Place them on any of our products, and sell them on the world's most popular online marketplaces and platforms, while we
beautiful September day, but Sean Taylor was trapped in his car in one of the worst cases of gridlock. We've all dreamed of world peace at one time or another. Cynics might say that total uninterrupted peace on a global scale is something that could never be achieved. Wars, crime, unstable political relationships, international tension. As long as human beings have the capacity for these things, they will remain as obstacles standing in the way of world peace. And then there's all the SCPs and dangerous anomalies out there. Just the existence of half of the horrors contained by the SCP Foundation could easily bring about the end of the entire world as we know it. And it's hard to achieve peace when death and destruction could be right around the corner. But what if that wasn't the case? What if there was no end of the world? SCP-6001. Welcome to Avalon. A safer and more peaceful world has always been at least partially the goal of the SCP Foundation. And it is true that without their containment and understanding of anomalous objects, the world would be a far more dangerous place if it wasn't completely destroyed in its entirety. However, there is always more that the Foundation could do with their vast resources to improve the world. There are even SCPs that they have contained whose anomalous abilities could greatly benefit all of mankind, but the organization would hardly ever approve of doing anything like that, right? Well, SCP-6001 is a universe in which that actually happened, or rather something similar happened. Here, the resources of an organization like the Foundation were put to better use, and ultimately created a utopia, a paradise for all, achieving what we referred to at the start of this video: world peace. The entry for SCP-6001 on the SCP Archive opens with an email addressed to us from a member of Foundation personnel called David Caspian. That reads, "Hey, sorry, I know it's late, but I just had to share this with someone, and there is no one in the world I'd rather share it with than you. I just had the most incredible day." Then, as the article continues, there are numerous format changes from the standard SCP Foundation entries that we're familiar with. In particular, the type of terminology is vastly altered from what we'd be familiar with. The term SCP is now Phenom. Special containment procedures have been replaced with modus. Imprimis takes the place of description, and even the name of the organization is different: the Compendium Phenomic Inquiry. This appears to be a version of the SCP Foundation that exists in some kind of parallel universe or alternate timeline to the Foundation that we know. Phenom 6001 itself is a tiny microscopic singularity, uncovered in the Tokyo of this other universe's Japan. This singularity is linked to another version of Tokyo from another universe, which is referred to as A6K. This universe, A6K, is described by the Compendium as being similar to their own reality, in almost every superficial and surface-level way. It looks the same, contains the same people, the same places, and even the same anomalies, but that is where the similarities end. The A6K universe diverges from this baseline by having a general lack of cooperation among its inhabitants, scientific repression along with heightened paranoia, aggression, and levels of violence. Sound familiar? It should, because A6K's main scientific institution is a group known as the SCP Foundation. That's right, A6K is the Foundation's reality. The Foundation is aware of what it refers to as SCP-6001, but because of the tiny size of the singularity that links their world with that of the Compendium, none of their personnel are able to travel through to that reality. The Compendium states that it is considering unifying with the Foundation, striking up an alliance between universes. However, they both have dramatically different approaches which would likely get in the way of that. The SCP Foundation has always been shrouded in secrecy, never revealing anything to the public, often eliminating or memory wiping anyone who witnesses an anomaly just to keep everything under wraps. Meanwhile, in their universe, the CPI has willingly made its documents and anomalous information available to anyone that asks for it. In the Foundation's reality, the world they were linked to via SCP-6001 was seemingly first discovered when David Caspian, the personnel member we mentioned earlier, punched over the spot where the singularity was located for almost 5 minutes. He had been doing this for a number of weeks since the Foundation's instruments first detected the existence of the tiny hole connecting A6K with another dimension.
Getting to net zero means change.
It means working together with our customers to meet their growing demand for cleaner
Mention. David's focus had been so fixated on that spot where SCP-6001 was, that it wasn't until he got back up that he realized he was in a completely different universe. He described tall, rounded skyscrapers unlike the Tokyo of the Foundation's world. Gigantic ivy growing up the buildings with leaves the size of cars. The clouds above had been replaced with the clearest blue sky, and clean, fresh air took the place of the stale, polluted environment David had just left. A nearby cat was perched on the same rooftop as David, watching strange, seed-shaped glass constructs floating on the horizon, filled with lush green innards. The cat had a coat of spotted orange, white and brown underneath an actual coat, a violet blazer complete with a white bow under the collar, and a black brooch pinned to it, the shape of an eye inside a globe. It even wore a pair of spectacles. The cat Primrose greeted David by name and introduced herself, the pair sharing a brief joke about stepping through the looking glass. Both of them were doctors. In fact, David was the Foundation's head of alt-dimensional research. When he asked Primrose how he'd arrived on her side of SCP-6001, she responded by asking if he had heard of something called cross-dimensional test sampling. Of course, David was more than familiar with it. Not only was it a standard procedure for the SCP Foundation, but one that he himself had written. The procedure involved bringing an isolated part of another reality to a safe environment within one's own for testing purposes. This is exactly what the Compendium had done to bring David to their universe. According to Primrose, the Compendium had many similar procedures to the Foundation, causing David to ask why, if this was the case, he wasn't being scanned or checked for contaminants and pathogens, or paralyzed to prevent kinetographic mimetics. Primrose responded by simply asking if he had eaten breakfast, and seemingly inviting him to Paris. Primrose then sat with David on an armchair on the Tokyo rooftop, and spoke an address to it. The next moment she and David were transported to Paris, in a courtyard filled with similar chairs that other people and animals were using to teleport. Primrose referred to them as the Everywhere Chair, a form of public transport. David remarked that there was something similar in the A6K universe, referring to SCP-1609, which was destroyed by the Global Occult Coalition. The cat responded by saying that David would find many similarities between their universes, and mentioned that she was the department head of transdimensional development and discovery for the CPI. But then Primrose declared she no longer wanted to discuss work as she was already off the clock, despite it only being the early hours of the morning. When David questioned this, Primrose replied, "The wonders of automation, David. More hands make less work, and we have a lot of hands. Besides, I have something more important lined up for today." She then ordered œufs brouillés from a holographic menu, and David ordered the same, remarking, "When in Rome, or Paris, or a parallel reality with talking cats, you do as the Romans." David then asked Primrose about the Compendium, learning that it was the primary scientific institute, but it lacked the employees of the SCP Foundation. Primrose and her fellow researchers were under no obligation to work for the CPI, but rather were able to choose to work with them out of their own curiosity or interest. The Compendium was also responsible for running the governments, economies, and law enforcement of the entire world, with Primrose likening the organization to benevolent dictators. David then expressed surprise that people didn't resist the Compendium taking control of the world, to which his feline counterpart replied, "Goodness, no. Governments? Certainly. Corporations? Absolutely. The people, though. Imagine a foreign power suddenly swooping in and saying, 'Hey there, so we're in charge now. Here's universal healthcare, living wages, housing, infrastructure, and total liberty from anyone but us. And literally all we ask you is to respect basic human rights. That's it. We provide the rest tax-free.' This also includes ethically replicated barbecue, instant global transport, and adorable talking animals. Also the cure to cancer. Can you really think of anyone so wedded to the existing power structures that they just say no to all that? It is easy to see why people would so willingly accept something so universally beneficial. By the time the Compendium had gone public, they already had been working with world governments in the shadows, much like the SCP Foundation. At first, the public response had been rough, but all it took was a few years of human life on Earth improving to help the naysayers change their tune. Partway through their meal, David and Primrose discussed the Compendium further. She revealed that something called Pact 15 was currently in the process of being rolled out worldwide. Pact stood for Phenom Application and/or Combination Technology, phenoms being the CPI term for an SCP or anomaly. The initiative had come about after the compendium studied an Australian talking spider, or SCP-1470 as David knew it. The goal of PAX was to find a use for phenoms that would not only be beneficial to the people of their universe, but would also benefit the phenoms themselves. These creatures, objects, or entities were all given the freedom to choose whether or not they complied, and those that did would find their existence to be bliss. David was given a tour of Primrose's world, encountering all manner of familiar SCPs that had been repurposed and allowed to live their best possible lives alongside human beings, living in uninterrupted peace. For example, Dr. Clef seemingly pulled off the impossible by finally curing 682 of its aggression, shortly after finding a whole nest of the creatures. 682's species, dubbed the Immortigons, have since both proliferated and really mellowed out, with the OG 682 stating that it no longer finds humans disgusting. Another nightmarish anomaly from David's universe, SCP-173 the Sculpture, has found a new lease on life in this world too. It lives in a museum, adored by everyone who sees it, and it uses a mere second of being unseen every night to reshape itself into a new beautiful construction. Turns out a lot of its aggression